Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Economic Journal lecture. We have a very rich program today. Stefanie Stantcheva is going to give us her lecture. And before we get to Stefanie, we are going to award the two prizes that the Royal Economic Society manages annually. And we're going to start from the Royal Economic Society prize, which is awarded annually for the best paper published in the Economic Journal. Competition was very tough, and the judges were very fortunate to have to choose between an amazing set of papers. The judging panel this year consisted of Chris Wallace, Tim Besley, and myself. And the prize was awarded to Michael Koch, Ilya Manulov, and Marcel Smolka for the paper Robots and Firms, which was published in the Economic Journal in August 2021. The study makes a very important contribution in analyzing the differential effects of robots across types of firms and the consequences of their adoption in terms of productivity and employment. The Society just posted a very nice short video by the authors describing their own work. The link should be appearing somewhere on the screen. We're all, the jury is very happy with this prize. I want to give the floor to the authors for a few words.
Dear audience, we're extremely honored to receive this prize. We would like to thank the editor, Nezih Gunnar, and the reviewers for helping the paper to achieve the level of impact and attention it deserves. Special thanks also goes to the Carlsberg Foundation and Find Research Center for their support of the project. And we hope that this prize will attract even more focus to the research on different aspects of automation and pave the way for new interesting studies in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilya and Michael. This is really an honor for us to be managing such good papers. So let me move on to the second prize announcement, which is the Austin Robinson Memorial Prize. This prize is awarded annually for the best paper published in the journal by young authors within 5 years of receiving their PhD. The prize is awarded by the managing editors of the Economic Journal. And this year, the prize has been awarded to the paper The Geography of Unconventional Innovation by Enrico Berkes and Ruben Gaetani. Again, the topic can hardly be overestimated. Innovation is at the heart of modern growth, and understanding the mechanics behind its dynamics is a first order concern for economists and policymakers alike. Your contribution is very elegant. It combines new interesting facts with a new model. So congratulations on behalf of all the editors. I'm going to give you the floor for a few words.
Thank you, Francesco, also for the kind words you spent on our paper. Thank you to the Royal Economic Society and to the editors of the Economic Journal for awarding us this prize. This award is a great honor for us, and we would like also to thank, also on behalf of Enrico, the editor Joachim Bott, and the rest of the reviewing team at the Economic Journal. We hope that with this prize we'll have even more motivation to keep working here at the intersection of geography and innovation, which, as you said, I think it's a very important field to explore. Thanks, Francesco.
You're very welcome. Thanks to you both. And so let me now move on to the core of today's program, this lecture. We are extremely honored and happy to have Stefanie Stantcheva with us today, delivering the Economic Journal lecture. Stefanie is an expert in several, when reviewing her CV, I was impressed by the broad range and coverage that her research has. She has done very good work, theoretical work on optimal taxation, which is, as we all know, a very hard subject to be good at. But she doesn't stop there, because not only she has written amazing theory papers, she has done very good empirical work, and she's developing some path-breaking measurement that is relevant. What some colleagues call the social economics, so developing new surveys and new measures of perceptions of all these very important economic objects that are not that easy to measure, even though they feature prominently in our models. So Stefanie, I think, has a very broad research program, one that is important for policymakers. And I think of her work as one of the best examples that, I'll quote to my students in terms of being a good economist when you're doing well in the theory that we use to interpret the phenomena in front of our eyes, as well as in the measurement of this phenomena. Everything is rooted in rigorous models and precise measurement exercises. So without taking more time, I will give her the floor, and I'll be collecting questions from the audience. So please use the chat if you have questions for Stefanie. And without further ado, I will give her the floor. Thank you, Stefanie, for being with us today.
Thank you, Francesco, and thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. It's really an honor to be presenting in front of you today. And congratulations to the awardees here for their great papers too. So today I wanted to tell you a little bit about some new research on what people think about economic policies. And we'll actually focus more specifically on redistribution policies. So things like progressive taxation, social insurance, transfers to lower income households, etc. And, why are these such important issues? So I probably don't need to convince you that inequality is rising in many countries across the world, and finding better policies to act against it is really critical. But for that, we cannot only study, what the effects of policies are and what they do. That's certainly extremely important and sort of the bulk of what we do as economists. But we also need to understand how people actually think about these policies. And so this is a bit the goal of this talk here. So hopefully you can come out of it with a bit of a better understanding on some of the core factors that shape people's view on redistribution policies. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the core method that I use in all these projects so that you get a sense where these results come from. And then I will outline a framework that I find very useful to think about all these various phenomena and dive into 4 specific aspects of people's economic policy views. So the method that we're using in the social economics lab at Harvard is what I call social economic surveys. And it's called social economics because it's how people form views about economic policy issues and economic topics, but taking into account broader social phenomena and their broader social context. And the method is basically new style social economic surveys and experiments that we can leverage to really go in depth in people's minds and understand how they're thinking. And of course, surveys have existed for a very long time. Historically, they've been used to measure things like income, family situation, employment, etc., that arguably now are much better measured in administrative data sets, like tax records or security data. There's also been a lot of what we call opinion polls, pretty quick polls done, on people either per phone or in the street, etc., that don't go more in depth to actually try to understand why people reason in a given way. And this is something different here. So these surveys here are really trying to go very much in depth in a interactive, almost, model-driven way to try and disentangle what people think about various aspects of policies. And a lot of the work here goes really into designing it so that they're understandable to people, intuitive, often interactive, and also that the frame is controlled in a way, for instance, experimentally showing respondents one type of information and others another one. And these tools are really key because they're things that still remain invisible in other data, no matter how great it is. These are things like perceptions, attitudes, knowledge, or views. And these are things which even our traditional reveal preference methods have a hard time addressing, where they hit some limits, because these are not things that we easily reveal with our observable behavior. And sometimes the most fruitful way is to actually dive into people's minds directly. So as I said, let me continue with a very short framework that I find very helpful to think about economic policy views, and specifically views on redistribution policy. So when we think about should we support a given redistribution policy or not, we typically, explicitly or implicitly, form views on the following factors. So first, we think about the efficiency costs of a policy. These are the economic costs or benefits. So for instance, what will it do to economic activity? What will happen to unemployment, to growth? Second, we typically think about who wins and who loses from a given policy. So is it going to be mostly lower income people who gain, or some particular types of people like retirees or immigrants or minorities or people in a particular sector? And then third, we form some views on how fair we think those gains and losses are. So this is related to concerns like how fair is inequality to start with? Are people entitled to keep their income? Is income mainly the result of luck versus effort, etc.? And then fourth, very importantly, the trustworthiness of the government. So for instance, the competence and the benevolence of governments and how we think that, that will influence the policy success is another very important concern that people have. And I've written here at the bottom of the page that importantly, these are all perceived factors. So they may or may not be in line with reality. Some of them, like fairness views, do not even have a reality counterpart. And so this is where we want to start exploring what people think. And if we dive deeper into one specific example, tax policy, we can actually illustrate this framework with some recent results here that show how people actually think about this policy. And I've separated people by whether they're more left-leaning or more right-leaning. Tax policy, unsurprisingly, is a very polarized issue. It's almost a quintessential polarized issue back in time as well. That's almost defining what's left and right on the economic policy spectrum. So if you are someone here who's more left-leaning, you will tend to think that taxes have smaller economic costs overall. You will also be more likely to think that raising taxes to increase revenues will help many people. And you don't really believe in this idea of trickle down, that if you cut taxes on high incomes, it's going to benefit everyone, that it's going to be the tide that lifts all boats. Your fairness views are such that you tend to view inequality as mostly unfair. And you believe that while people can influence their income and outcomes through their own effort and individual action, there's still a lot of it that's left to luck, to factors that you cannot control. And you also tend to think that overall, the government should have a pretty broad scope and you trust it more as an institution, not necessarily a particular administration or a particular government. And finally, if you go down even to the level of basic reality, so things that we can look up, so plain facts that you can search for on Google, even there people have different views depending on whether they're on the left and on the right. So for instance, someone who's on the left will tend to think that taxes are currently lower, less progressive than someone on the right will think. And they will also tend to view inequality as higher and that it has increased more than someone on the right. And while no group is systematically more accurate than the other, the gaps are always in that direction, in that partisan direction. Okay, so if we stick to the example of tax policy and more generally redistribution and consider all these factors, what matters most across all these? Is it the views of the government, of the current tax system, of the efficiency effect? What's the most important? And what we can see is that if we horse race these factors, either experimentally or with a decomposition, what we can see is that in the end, what matters most to people is who they think wins and loses and how fair these gains and losses are to them. So to put it simply, the reason people support different redistribution policies is not because they have such different views on economic costs and benefits. They do, but the main reason is that they have very different perceptions of who the winners and losers are and very different notions of what's fair. So fairness is really in the eye of the beholder, which makes us want to drill down into what are these fairness views that people hold. And so in this talk, I want to focus on 4 key factors that shape how fair people think a given policy is and related to this notion of who they think the losers and winners of redistribution are. And so the issues I want to cover in this order are first, social mobility and equality of opportunity, then immigration, racial attitudes, and then perceptions of one's own ranking relative to others. So let me dive into the first topic of social mobility without further waiting. So in this paper, we asked, what is the link between intergenerational mobility, or rather perceived mobility, and preferred redistribution policies? And the existing theories that you may know are that, if you believe in equality of opportunity more, so that everyone has the same chances to start with, then you're much more willing to tolerate inequality of outcomes. Because if you think that the path to a given distribution of income was fair, then you're much more likely to think the outcomes are the result of individual merit or effort. But are people's views of mobility even in line with reality? So to check this, we conducted surveys in 5 countries. So here we have France, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And we try to ask people what their perceptions of mobility are. So as I mentioned, a lot of work goes into the design of these questions. And so for mobility, what we do is to show people visually these ladders that represent income distributions and groupings. So we start by telling people that there's 500 families that represent, in this case, the US population. And on the left, they have the parents' income group. So this is the parents ranked from the 100 richest parents to the 100 poorest parents. On the right, we have the children's income distribution once the children become adults, again, ranked from the 100 richest to the 100 poorest. And we asked respondents to take 100 children born in the 100 poorest families and allocate them to each of these 5 rungs of the ladder, to each of these 5 groups, basically, which are quintiles. And this allows us to see, intuitively, visually, what do people think about the chances of a kid, from the bottom growing up and making it to each of the quintiles of the income distribution. So what do we find here? Well, let's start with the perceived probability of remaining stuck in the bottom. So a child from the bottom remaining stuck in the bottom. So this is what this graph here shows. So on this figure, you can see 1 dot per country. So on the horizontal axis, you can read off the actual probabilities of remaining stuck in the bottom. So for instance, in the US, 33 children out of 100 who are born in the bottom quintile will remain in the bottom quintile when they grow up. And that number is 27 for Sweden. So in general here, just visually, you can see that the European countries are more mobile on average than the US, according to this metric. On the vertical axis, you can see the average perception across respondents in that country. So I've labeled here the upper region pessimistic because this is where people overestimate the chance of staying stuck in poverty. And the lower region is optimistic. This is where people underestimate the chance of staying stuck in poverty. So here, actually, the US is relatively accurate, but European countries are actually too pessimistic. So they're not only more pessimistic than the US, that was sort of known, but they're too pessimistic relative to the reality in their country. We can also look at another metric to see if this is actually a consistent finding or not. So another possible metric is this idea of the American dream, this idea of making it from rags to riches, so climbing from the very bottom quintile to the very top quintile. So on this chart, again, with 1 dot per country, we can read on the horizontal axis the chance of a kid born in the 100 poorest families making it to the very top of the ladder. And comparing again between European and US countries, you see that according to this metric too, European countries are actually more mobile. So in a sense, this American dream idea is truly more alive in Europe in a sense. And looking at the vertical axis now, comparing the perceptions to the reality, you see that while European countries are a bit too pessimistic again on this American dream idea, the US is too optimistic relative to the reality in the US. So the idea of the American dream is still very salient, although it is not borne out by the data. And I won't show you this with a figure, but you can ask this ladder question in different ways. So for instance, if you're interested in what people think the role of effort is, one thing you can do is to prime people to think about, for instance, a very hardworking child that puts in a lot of effort in school and then later in their work, and ask, where do you think that child will land in that ladder? And what we can see is that across countries, people definitely believe that effort will do something. They believe that effort will get you into the middle class, for instance, but actually very few people think effort will get you to the very top. And so what does this imply for policy views, which is in the end, the important question? What we can see is that equality of opportunity is a really one particular topic where there's a lot of bipartisan agreement, in the sense that everybody agrees that lack of opportunity is a problem. So nobody likes it when there is a lack of opportunity and lack of equality of chances. However, the solution that people perceive for this problem are very, very different. So people who are more left-leaning, when they're more pessimistic about mobility, they want more redistribution. So even within left-wing respondents, those that have worse views about mobility will want more progressive taxes, more equality of opportunity policies like education or spending on health. And this is true in the correlations, but it's also true experimentally. If you show a randomly selected subsample of people negative information about mobility, they tend to want more of those redistributive policies. But if you're someone who's more right-leaning, you tend to view the government as part of the problem rather than the solution. So you believe that a better way to improve opportunities is rather for the government to get out of the economy and free the economy, let it function, rather than to intervene more. So incredibly different perceived solutions to a problem that everyone agrees is a problem. And this can be mapped, of course, to very different underlying attitudes about government that has been borne out in other work. For instance, work here cited showing that if you decrease trust in government experimentally by making people think about aspects of the government they don't really like, then people start supporting less redistribution. Great, so this is on mobility. And the next big topic is on immigration. And so obviously immigration is and was and probably will be in the debate in many elections, in many policy issues. And it's been suggested on many occasions that generosity, whether private or also public generosity in the form of redistribution, doesn't travel very well across ethnic, national, or religious lines, definitely not as well as it does within. And so we wanted to see, is this true? Does more immigration or more perceived immigration or specific types of immigration reduce people's support for the welfare state and redistribution policy? And if you think back of the framework at the very beginning of the slides, we're again talking about these two key components for policy views, which is who do people think benefits from redistribution? In this case, is it immigrants, according to them? And to what extent they think this is fair and deserved. So we also, of course, want to check to start with whether people have accurate perceptions about immigrants. So, do they understand the number, the origins, the economic characteristics like education, unemployment, poverty, reliance on government transfers of immigrants or not? And so in this project, we surveyed more than 22,000 respondents in 6 countries. So we have France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And we define an immigrant as being very precisely someone who's foreign born, so who's not born in the country. This is to avoid, issues related to different naturalization rules in different countries, and it's the official OECD definition. So let me start with some results on people's perceptions of immigrants first. So here on this slide, you can see perceptions about the actual share of immigrants in a country. So on this graph, each row is one country, and then the horizontal axis shows you the actual share of immigrants in a country, that's the blue diamond, and the average perception of respondents in that country, that's the red square. So you can see that in all countries, without exception, respondents very starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. So for instance, in the US, people think that a third of people are immigrants, and the reality is 10% if you count only documented immigrants, and up to 14%, that's an estimate, if you count undocumented immigrants as well. And if you added second generation immigrants to that figure, with the idea that maybe people confuse what's first, what's second generation, it definitely would not close this gap. So it would improve the picture a bit, but it wouldn't close the gap by any means. And there's some other findings which I want to just very briefly allude to, which is the important thing is not just the perception of the number and share of immigrants, but some other characteristics too. So for instance, people tend to perceive immigrants as more culturally distant from them. So on this graph here, you can see the gap between the perceived and actual share of Muslim immigrants in the countries. On economic matters, people tend to think, for instance, that the average immigrant receives at least twice as many transfers as the average non-immigrant in the country. So this graph here shows you the share of respondents who think so per country. So for instance, in France, a quarter of respondents think that immigrants get at least twice the amount of transfers that non-immigrants get, which is not true in any of these countries. Then we also asked some questions to try and see directly whether people have some bias against immigrants. So the question that we ask is to tell people about two identical men, except that one is an immigrant and the other is not. And they're described to have the exact same family situation, the same income, age, living in the same place, etc. But one of them is a non-immigrant called John, and the other one is an immigrant called Mohammed. And we asked people, do you think that Mohammed pays less taxes, the same taxes, or more taxes than John? And same for transfers. Do they get less transfers, the same, or more transfers than John? And note that based on what we told them, they should think that it's the same. There's no reason to think it's otherwise. And so on this figure, you can see the share of respondents who say, yes, Mohammed gets more transfers and pays less taxes than John. And basically in Sweden, people are pretty accurate here. So they say close to zero, which is the only accurate answer based on the info. But in countries like Italy and France, more than 33% of respondents think that the immigrant systematically pays less taxes, gets more transfers. And in general, across countries, we ask for a wide range of perceptions about immigrants. And we can see that people very systematically think that immigrants are economically weaker, more unemployed, less educated, more reliant on government transfers, and more culturally distant from them. And there's some groups that are slightly more accurate than others, but the reality is that most people are quite inaccurate along these dimensions. So still, if we want to say where the error is the largest, we can see that the least accurate groups are those without a college education, those who work in lower paid jobs in sectors that employ many immigrants, and then right-leaning respondents. And on the political gap, what's interesting is that left and right-wing respondents perceive the same overall share of immigrants. So they overinflate it to the same extent, but they think immigrants have very different characteristics. So in general, when you think about an average immigrant, someone on the left and someone on the right will just have very different pictures in their minds. So how does this relate? How does this relate to policy views? Well, one thing that we see is that just making people think about immigrants before asking them questions on policies for redistribution makes them less likely to support redistribution. So just inverting the order in which questions are asked without providing any information, we see that people who get asked about immigration first will start thinking that they want less redistribution. And the biggest predictor for why this happens, of whether people will reduce support for redistribution, is first, the perception that immigrants free ride and don't put in the hard work. So people who think that are more likely to reduce their support for redistribution. And then the second big factor is whether they think immigrants are economically weak. On the other hand, just perceiving that immigrants are more culturally distant or that there are more of them, that per se does not really change people's views on redistribution, although it changes their views on how much immigration they want overall. And because of that, showing people information on the share of immigrants and their origins really doesn't shift their views on redistribution. On the other hand, telling them about a day in the life of a very hardworking immigrant, which is more of a narrative, a story, that has positive impacts on their support for redistribution. And clearly, you can think of this being a story that counters the free rider narrative, or the narrative that immigrants do not work hard in people's views. And so if we think about more broadly, it keeps shifting. And so if we think a bit more broadly about what really can do something here, the facts about things that people may not care about as much per se are really not effective, while countering narratives that are pretty entrenched in their mind about how much immigrants contribute economically, how much hard work they put in, that can be more effective. The third topic is on racial attitudes, and this is only for the US. So this is a project that's done on a large sample of African Americans and white Americans in the US. And so what we wanted to understand here is this longstanding issue in the US that attitudes towards race really seem to shape people's support for redistribution and actually for many more policies as well. And so to study this interaction, what we did is to survey non-Hispanic Black and white respondents, and we surveyed both adults and also teenagers that are aged 13 to 17. And we oversample Black respondents here so that they make up half of the sample. And we asked respondents about their perceptions of the economic conditions and opportunities of both Black and white Americans. So sort of, what do you know about your own racial group? And can we benchmark this against what you know about the other racial group? We also asked them about their attitudes on racial issues and their views on the causes of racial inequities and their degree of support for race-targeted and general redistribution policies. And so what do we find? What we find is that there's very large disagreements in how people perceive the economic conditions and opportunities of Black and white Americans. But by far the biggest disagreements across people lie in their perceived causes of racial inequities. So people tend to disagree on what is currently the case, how many gaps there are, how large those gaps are, but they disagree much more about why they think those gaps exist. And consequently, they very much disagree about what should be done to remedy them. And when we think about what policy actions people could take to want to remedy racial gaps, we can distinguish between race-targeted policies, so policies that explicitly condition on race, like preferential labor market policies or reparations, versus general redistribution, which is income targeted, that doesn't specifically condition on race, but because some racial groups tend to be on average lower income than others, may affect some groups more than others. And what we see is that people's support for either general redistribution or race-targeted policies doesn't really depend on their magnitude, on their perceptions of the magnitudes of racial gaps, but it depends on why they think those gaps exist in the first place. And here again, we can see pretty large partisan gaps. In fact, if we look at white respondents, we can see that they're very strongly divided by political affiliation. And along many of these dimensions we asked about, white Democratic respondents are actually more aligned with Black Democratic respondents than they are with white Republican respondents. And so to very, schematically here summarize, the views in an oversimplified way, Black and white Democratic respondents will tend to attribute persistent racial gaps to systemic causes like past slavery, longstanding discrimination, racism. And they will tend to support policies to reduce them, like income-targeted redistribution and race-targeted policies. On the other hand, white Republican respondents will tend to view racial inequities primarily as the result of lack of effort and individual decisions. So they will tend to think it's not systemic issues, it's individual actions. And they'll be less inclined to support either redistribution or race-targeted policies to reduce these gaps. What was incredibly striking to us is that these racial and partisan gaps are already very prevalent among teenagers. So if you ask teenagers, do they live in a Republican household? So are their parents Republican? Are their parents Democratic? What you can see is that the views that teens will express are very much in line with the partisan affiliation of their parents. And they will even exhibit some more polarization on some dimensions. So teenagers will have similar partisan gaps, sometimes even larger ones than their parents. And so when it comes to looking at what affects policy views here, what we can do with an experiment is to show people info on the gaps in earnings and opportunities between Black and white people, or to explain to them some of the causes and consequences of systemic racism. And what we can see is that simply showing people how unequal circumstances are really doesn't move their beliefs on why they're unequal and doesn't change the narrative that respondents believe in. But on the other hand, explaining to people some of the causes, that changes the how, the why this happens, that changes their narrative, and that has much more effect. Yet, these beliefs that matter the most are also quite entrenched and difficult to move. So for instance, some respondents towards the right of the political spectrum, when their view explanations, possible systemic explanations of what's happening today, tend to say that these explanations are left-wing biased. And so to some extent, this mirrors a little bit, our world, although there are clearly large racial gaps along many econ and social dimensions. And although many people are, at least to some extent, aware of them, they disagree on their causes and hence on the way or even need to resolve them. So the final issue I wanted to talk about here is people's position, their perceived position relative to others, and how that matters for their views on what they think is fair. So in this paper, we address some pretty long-standing questions in social science about social status and people's views on inequality and fairness. In the policy debate, a lot of discussions are about where do I rank relative to others? Where does my group rank relative to others? And so these seem to be important considerations for people. But again, how well do people even know where they are relative to others? So we're interested in knowing how well do people know where they rank in their various reference groups. So by where they rank, we're going to simply mean what do they think their income position is in the income distribution of each group. And we want to consider several groups that may be relevant to people, ranging from large groups like people in your cohort, people living in your city, people with the same level of education or in the same sector as you, etc., but also smaller groups such as people in your street or apartment building, your coworkers in your workplace, your former schoolmates, etc. And it's quite challenging to study these issues given data requirements, because you need to know data on people's perceptions, so what they think, where they rank. And you also need to know the reality, which requires knowing their own income and the incomes of everyone in their reference groups. So the data requirements are really challenging. So what we were able to do here is to leverage a new data, which links our own survey data that we design and that we run to administrative tax records that contain people's full information on their income histories back in time, shocks that have happened to them, like unemployment, promotions, etc., and for them, and also all their reference groups. So we can luckily do this in Denmark, where we can match the survey to administrative data and nicely elicit on the survey side people's perceptions about income positions and views on inequality and fairness, and look at the tax data to actually see sort of the reality of actual positions and histories. And so here's how we do it in a bit more detail. So first, we want to know whether people are even aware of the incomes of various groups. So do they perceive the right income distribution? So we start by asking them about the income distributions of their own reference groups. And the questions that they see are adapted to them. So they see questions directly about groups that they're part of. So let's take an example here of this respondent who's born in 1970. So to start, we ask them, what is the median income, which we call P50, and that we defined very carefully to people with an explainer video. What is the P50 among people born in 1970? And so the respondent enters a guess about this income. And then we ask them, how about these other groups that you're part of? So, this respondent here is a man born in 1970, lives in Copenhagen, has a master or PhD, and works in finance and insurance. So those are the groups that he is asked about. And then for each reference group, we ask them to place themselves in a ladder, which allows them to move a slider and say, among people born in 1970, this is where I think I rank. Among people, living in Copenhagen, this is where I think I rank. And here's what we find. So this is showing you respondents' perceptions of their own position in the cohort, among people born in the same year as them. The horizontal axis shows you their actual position, and then the vertical axis shows you the average or the median perceived position. So we can see this inverted or flattened S shape here, whereby respondents with lower positions will tend to overestimate their position, and those with higher positions will tend to underestimate them. So this holds for the cohort, and particularly it's not that large for the cohort. So the gaps between perceptions and reality are not that big. But the same pattern actually appears for all the other reference groups. So if I show you the figure for all other reference groups, the large groups like cohort, gender, municipality, education, sector groups, you can see that same pattern with different magnitudes. So people who are ranked lower will tend to think they're systematically ranked higher in any of the reference groups. And those that are ranked higher will tend to think they're truly ranked lower. You can also see that the magnitudes differ a little bit. So people who are asked to rank themselves in their education or sector group, they have the largest misperceptions. So you can see that the lower ranked people tend to overestimate their position most among the education groups or among the sector groups. So in a sense, this is where people don't realize how highly paid others are in that group, and they tend to underestimate inequality in those groups. So we will call this pattern center bias. It's this idea that you will tend to think you're closer to the center of a given distribution. And we can actually pinpoint exactly where it comes from. In particular, because we have all the administrative data, we can see that it does not come from you being wrong about your own income. So people are quite accurate about that. It comes from systematically misperceiving others' incomes, and in a very systematic way. So people who are basically richer themselves, they tend to think everyone else is richer too. So they will think the median income is higher, the top income is higher. People who are lower income will tend to think others are poorer too. They will think the median is lower, the top of the distribution is lower. And because of that, they will perceive the whole distribution as shifted in a sense, in a way that puts them closer to the center. And you can see that this is pretty consistent with different magnitudes across different groups. And so if we look at also how fair people think these inequalities are, we can see that actually inequalities that are considered to be most unfair are exactly the inequalities between people who work in the same firm or sector, or between people with the same level of education. And these are exactly the inequalities that people underestimate. So this is exactly where people who are lower ranked tend to overestimate their position the most. So in a sense, people seem to understand that if you live in the same city, you have different levels of income, or if you're of the same gender, of the same cohort. But if you have the same level of education and work in the same sector, people are much less willing to accept the reasons for why you end up with such different incomes. And paradoxically, these are also the inequalities that they tend to underestimate the most. So how does these perceptions of where you rank relative to others shape your views on inequality? What we can see is that people who are ranked higher in each group, they tend to think that income inequality within that group is more fair. So they're more accepting of inequality in groups where they themselves are ranked higher. In addition, they will also tend to think that income differences in that group are rather due to effort, so things you can control, rather than to luck, adverse circumstances that you can't control. They also tend to believe that their own work has paid off more and that high income earners deserve their income. They're more likely to vote for right of center parties and to support less redistribution. And we can compare these views to some other ones that seem to be much stickier. So for instance, if you look at your views of unfairness, they tend to fluctuate when your own position changes over time. So when you do better, you tend to think things are more fair. When you do worse, you tend to think things are more unfair. But things like political views, who you vote for instance, that does not fluctuate that much. That is much stickier. So it seems to be much more related to your permanent component of position rather than the transitory fluctuations as well. And thanks to our data, we can look at very precisely what happens after positive events versus negative events. So when people experience positive events, like a promotion at work that shifts them up their social positions, versus a negative event like unemployment, disability, hospitalizations that shift them down the positions, we can see that negative events make people think that inequality is less fair. And then a positive event, on the other hand, makes them think inequality is more fair. And finally, we also tell people where they truly rank. So people were asked, remember, to rank themselves within each group on a ladder. And so remember this respondent here who was born in 1970. Well, if that respondent was part of the treatment group, so half the sample, he will be told the true information about where he actually ranks. And so here for the cohort, unfortunately, this respondent is told that they rank 13 positions lower. So they're actually at P57. They're not at P70 among people born in 1970. And so what happens when people get that news? Well, what happens is that people who are informed that they are ranked lower than they thought become more likely to say inequality is unfair in all these reference groups. So receiving negative news about where you rank makes you more upset about inequality and makes you think inequality is less fair. So to conclude here, some of the core factors that I've looked into that shape people's views on policies are really who they think they gain and loses from a given policy and how fair they think that is. And these are really the aspects of people's thinking and considerations that I think are very fruitful to study and keep studying. So here we looked at it from 4 angles that were all about these intrinsic concerns of who benefits, who loses, how fair that is. So we looked at mobility, at immigration, at racial groups, and at social position relative to others. And there are, of course, many more to explore. So I look forward to your questions and comments, and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Stefanie. This was excellent. And I already have some questions from the floor. But let me start, if I may, with a question on my own. I've been thinking about this as you were presenting. So I think something that's interesting, I also see that's mentioned from the audience, is how to square these facts with a consistent interpretation. For instance, you provided a narrative to interpret the center bias when you were talking about self-perceptions about where you locate. I was thinking, how would I rationalize this? For instance, if the social position is income, and I am having in mind a model where income have some mean reversion, I'm poor today, but I know that on average, that wouldn't be such a bad metric. I mean, when I'm poor, I think, I'm what I mean? So, the question is, how can we choose the framework to interpret these very surprising findings? And let me add one question, which is, I think, in the same realm. When you were describing perceived social mobility, I noticed that some countries like the US and Italy tend to be both optimistic and realistic at the same time. For instance, US is realistic about the probability of moving upwards, but it's pessimistic about the possibility of staying at the bottom. And Italy is kind of the opposite. They seem to be okay with predicting the probability of moving upwards, but they're very pessimistic. So, I know that you have more than 2 dimensions, so this does not necessarily spot any inconsistencies, but how should we think of these sort of puzzling, apparently puzzling patterns?
Great question, thank you. So let me start with the last project here on the social positions, which obviously went a bit too fast to be able to explain all the things we did to look at it. So it's very important to ask whether this pattern, if you remember this center bias pattern, is mechanically driven by something. And there's 2 things you can think about mechanically that both could be called mean reversion. One is a bit of a cross-sectional mean reversion, which is people at the top can only underestimate, right, weakly their position. They cannot overestimate it. And people at the bottom, it's the opposite. And so you can look at, simulations, looking at people's, if everybody had the same errors, but they're just truncated, right, at the 2 sides, can you generate this? You can generate it a little bit on the ends, but you can't explain that big gap at the center. In addition, we're able to look at, and that was a very important part, to pinpoint where the error comes from, we can look at people's perceptions of others' incomes. That's why we asked them about, tell us the median income of that group and tell us the top. And we can see that the errors that people make about guessing the median and the top, those errors translate basically perfectly into them viewing their position wrongly. So it is really about you thinking others' incomes are different based on your own income. Like, I'm poor, I just intuitively perceive others to be sort of shifted to the left. Others are poor too. I'm richer, I will tend to think others are richer too. The second sort of mechanical mean reversion is in time, to your point, like, 1 year I may be poor, but then the next year I may be rich. And this is where it's also great to have this administrative data in time, because we can, for instance, look at people's average income over the last, say, 4 or 5 years. So we can look at a more permanent income concept and see that same pattern occurring. So it is not just about a temporary, fluctuation up and down. The fluctuations I showed you due to unemployment, etc., they matter as well, right? Because they do shift people down and they have a very clear effect on their views on fairness. So I think this is, we can pinpoint pretty well that it comes from you being wrong about others' incomes in a way that's systematically linked to yours. On the mobility, I think it's actually very consistent what we see there. So the US tends to always be slightly too optimistic. So it tends to underestimate the probability of things stuck in the bottom, but only by a little, and really overestimate the chance of making it to the top. On the other hand, European countries are always a bit too pessimistic. So pretty accurate, but a bit too pessimistic about the chance of moving to the top, but very over pessimistic about staying stuck in poverty. And this is actually very, perhaps very intuitive given other things we know and other answers people give, that in European countries, people are very, very concerned in a sense about like poverty and like what's happening with really low income people in the country. In the US, an American dream idea is very salient, and that shows. So I think these patterns are pretty consistent, but you're completely right that there's heterogeneity among respondents too within country. That was just a very coarse summary of the data. Like within country, there's very big differences, both in mobility where people live and also across people's characteristics.
Great, thanks a lot. So now let me read you some questions that we got from the audience. There's a question that reads, how do you read the results that people are not very responsive to facts, but are really responsive to narratives? This would imply that people are easily swung in either of the directions and unstable equilibria politically, or at the very least, easy to destabilize. Do you agree? And what are the solutions?
This is a very good question. So I often think about the domain that we're looking at. Are we looking at immigration? Are we looking at mobility? Are we looking at tax policy? So what are we looking at? And then what type of information does what? So on the immigration topic, it's clear that just the facts about the share of immigrants or where immigrants come from, they don't seem to matter to people. Not just the facts, but also that those core perceptions are not very correlated with their policy views on redistribution. And notice that I didn't talk about support for immigration per se. I'm really talking about how much redistribution people want. And what really seems to come out as a main predictor of redistribution policy views is the economic characteristics of immigrants and how much people think they contribute or don't contribute to the economy. And so addressing those perceptions is important. And here, because those are basically narrative perceptions, it seems like a narrative that counters it, like a story, has an effect on those. Now, this is not necessarily generalizable to other topics. So I'm, in the mobility paper, for instance, you see that it was very factual information we showed people about what is actually the mobility numbers in their country. And people absorb the information. They become more worried about mobility when they see the mobility numbers, but they just want different policy solutions based on whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning. So a very different reaction to information here. In the final paper, the information is incredibly personalized, right? You are told exactly about your own position in various groups, and that also has an effect. It is purely factual information. It is not by any means a narrative, but it's very personalized and clearly has a big effect too. So I would say the difference between facts or narratives will very much depend on the domain we're looking at, and it will just have very different impacts by domains.
All right, so let me, thank you. Let me move on and read you another question that says, have you tried to also ask respondents questions about some of their actions on top of voting choices, things like savings, children education, etc., that should be influenced by their perceptions in a predictable way? To what extent would their actions be in agreement with their perceptions? This is from Frank Portier, and others have voted it up.
Great question. Yes. So there's two things in your question. One is that I'm reading, at least. One is, do you have some actual behaviors, which are not just answers, perhaps the survey questions, but quote unquote real behaviors to see? And when it comes to, the things we're asking about here, it's really about policy views, what you want on policy. So you have to find some real outcomes that are related to that. So some of the things we consistently have in all these papers is questions that ask people to donate for a particular cause that is in line with that particular policy view. For instance, when it's about redistribution, donate to funds that help lower income families, etc. When it's about a project on climate change, like donating to causes for climate protection, etc. So sort of asking people to put real money into the game. Another one is to ask people to actually sign a petition that is then revealed to policymakers, truly, and sent, to policymakers that shows, for instance, look, we did this, and that many people agree with that statement. So that also has some almost like voting, voting aspect to it. Another thing then that I may be reading into your question is, does it change their private behaviors? That I think is more far removed from here, in the sense that we're truly asking people about what they want to have done on policy. What is their social preference? It's not so much, and that's the point of doing these surveys in a sense, these are not things that are easily revealed with their daily behaviors. What I think about immigrants and how much the government should increase the tax rate in response to immigration is not something I'll necessarily show in my daily behavior. And so in a sense, that's what justifies these surveys to start with. Now, when something is relevant, for instance, asking people about, do they worry about climate change, and do they want to take action? We ask them also about, do they try to save energy? Do they try to recycle? Do they try to use the car less, etc.? Because those behaviors are very closely linked to that issue. But it's not the case for all policies here.
All right. So thank you very much. And we still have about 9 minutes. So let me continue reading the questions from the floor. Shihang Hu from University of Oxford is asking, could center bias be related to geographical segregation? For instance, rich people live near other rich people and so on. And so they base their guesses based on what they observe, near them, I guess.
Great question. Yes. So remember that for this center bias, what's neat is to be able to look at very different types of reference groups. So some of them are geographical, to your point. Like, I didn't show you those results, but there's the large scale group, which is everyone in your city. And there's a small scale group, which is your immediate neighbors. So we ask about those. And people are more accurate about their neighbors than they are about their whole city. So there's clearly some of what you're alluding to in terms of proximity and observing people around you. But then there's also, again, different domains. So in addition to those geographical areas, there's people in your sector, right? That could be anywhere. That's a different dimension. Or people in your firm, particularly. And here you're just systematically more wrong. So ranking yourself in your sector or in your firm, similar to ranking yourself among people with your education level, in those domains, it seems that information is not flowing well. So there people tend to systematically underestimate inequality. And you can think of many stories, that go beyond proximity or strength of interactions or segregation. You can think of stories related to how the labor market functions, and perhaps that employers do not necessarily want all the info to circulate about how low paid you are relative to others in your firm, and ultimately in your sector. So we don't have the answer what exactly is causing that, but can possibly explore further and dig into more models to think about that.
Okay. I have 2 more questions at this moment. So let me read them to you. The first one is on the findings of racial inequalities. The question asks, did either of the race over or underestimate their economic conditions, considering the US were shown to be more optimistic? So I guess the question is about whether either race in the US turned out to be either over or pessimistic or optimistic about their own prospects.
Yeah, so we ask about many economic conditions and opportunity perception questions. So it looks in different ways. So I can give you a few summaries here. In general, when you ask people about, when you ask white respondents about, how are white people doing in the US, they're they're sometimes more optimistic, sometimes more pessimistic, depends on if you ask about unemployment, about incomes, etc. But when you ask them about Black people in the US, they typically tend to be too optimistic. So they tend to think Black people do better than is actually the case. On mobility, it's similar. So white respondents tend to the point of the first project I talked about, tend to overestimate mobility in the US on average, but they actually particularly overestimate it for Black children. So mobility for Black children is much lower than what people think it is, specifically white respondents. And so those gaps are, very systematic and very pronounced. Interestingly, Black respondents are too optimistic about the mobility of white children too. So white children do have higher mobility than Black children, but not by as much as Black respondents think. So there's all these different gaps. But on average, it very much confirms the first findings on mobility I showed you, that people in the US tend to be, on average, over-optimistic about mobility.
Good. So the last question I have is from Frank Portier again. He's asking you, if you try to see what are the perceptions at the bottom of the income distribution about how rich are the rich, I guess. This is another dimension of the bias.
So I think here, in the Danish paper, yes. So in the Danish paper, we asked people, about the median incomes and the top incomes in all of their groups, which include, city, where there's rich people, Denmark, etc. So yes, we do ask people from the bottom sort of what they think. And there is that pattern that I told you about, that when you are yourself lower income, you will tend to underestimate the top income. We measure it by the top fifth percentile. We ask them how much do people in the top 5% cutoff make. And so you tend to underestimate that. On the other hand, if you're richer, you actually overestimate that relative to reality. So yes, we do see that pattern. Now, I don't know what it is in the US. I have not done that experiment in the US. We could certainly ask people about the overall income inequality in the US. That I have done, not by reference groups, because I don't have this match to data to be able to check if they're accurate. In the US overall, there's that very strong, partisan gap where that I mentioned initially, where people who are more left-leaning actually tend to think inequality is higher. So high-income people make more than right-wing people do, and that there's more income in the top shares than right-wing people do.
All right. So, let me conclude with just some very general summary. So you've been talking about very relevant issues in different areas that are all like super important: social mobility, immigration, racial attitudes, and the self-perception in a social ranking. Now, if I had to push you a little bit, if we have to keep like a main proposition in mind, what is it that we learn from your research that is important for policy making and for contributing to understanding and improving the society around us? What would it be?
I think among all these very different policies and areas that I've covered, I think it's very much that if we're interested in seeing how people think about policies, the two core considerations to focus on are who they think wins and loses from that policy. And that looks very different across people and depends on the topic, and how fair they think that is, how much of their fairness views are embodied in this. So I think those are the two sort of key things to study, which I tried to illustrate in a sense here, topic by topic, how that looks like. But that would be the message I would give, like who wins, who loses, and how fair that is are the things to focus on to understand a large chunk of people's policy views.
Okay, then, let me conclude by thanking you for a great lecture, thanking the authors, recipient of the prizes for submitting their good work to the Economic Journal, inviting everyone out there to submit their best work to the EJ. And I'll close this session here. Thank you very much, Stefanie. It was a pleasure and an honor to meet you here. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all so much.